It's my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. Jane Leach, who is principal at Wesley House, Cambridge. She is also the Connexional Director of Supervision in the Methodist Church of Great Britain and one of the founders of the Association of Pastoral Supervision and Education for the UK. I'm particularly pleased that Dr. Leach is here to address us and share the wisdom and gleanings of her ministry and work. I was privileged to spend a 2-month sabbatical at Wesley House this past summer, and while I was there, I read her book on pastoral supervision. I found it excellent. I thought there were many aspects of this process that we could benefit from, and there is one of these books at each table. There is a book for each annual conference here. Dr. Leach, we hear you gladly.
Good morning. And are we yet alive? Excellent. I'm very grateful to Dr. Coate for the invitation to address you this morning and for her kind words, and also for the chance to share with you in this conference about clergy formation. This is something that was at the heart of my ministry for 20 years as a professor of practical theology in a British seminary context, and it continues to be core to what I'm doing as the National Director of Supervision for the British Methodist Church. It's been a very rich experience to be with you these few days, for me to learn with you. Just a note about the slides. They're already on the website, so if you prefer to see them on there, you can do. And the questions that I've suggested we might look at the end of the presentation, probably more legible on the website than they will be from the distance on the screen. I'm hoping the clicker is working, and I can't get it to work, so can I have some assistance from the back? You've all been there. So my intention this morning is to help you reflect on some of the choices that you face as you think about how to respond to the challenges of implementing the 8-year assessment. In doing so, I'm going to attempt to do 4 things. So first of all, to share with you some of the concerns in my own context that led to the setting up of mandatory supervision for the support and development of all clergy for the whole of their ministries, at whatever level of seniority they are in the life of the church. I'm going to say it again, because it's quite different, I think, from where you are, and it's quite different from where we were several years ago. So we made a decision in 2015 that we would introduce mandatory supervision for the support and development of all clergy for the whole of their ministries. So I'm going to share a little bit with you about what led to that decision. Secondly, I'm going to explain the way in which supervision is being understood in the British Methodist Church. Supervision is a word used in a variety of ways. I think mostly in your documents you use it as a synonym for oversight, and that's not the way exactly that we're using it. And thirdly, to consider some of the issues we've faced in the British Methodist Church in terms of implementation of we've created a system of supervision for a connection that is the size of some of your annual conferences. And I hope that this will all raise some practical questions for your own consideration as you think about how to accompany people through the 8-year assessment process, but also more broadly, how to support people through the whole arc of their ministry. So I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and there'll be some time for conversation around the table on some questions I suggest, and then I will take some questions from the floor. As I've been sharing in this conference this week, trying to click the slide on, oh, here we go, it's arrived. I've been wondering why you might be willing to listen to a voice from the Methodist Church in Britain. People have been asking me all week, so how is the church in the UK? With something of a note of sympathy in their voice. As you know, that like other mainstream denominations in Europe, we're facing rapid numerical decline. And that's been reminding me of a preaching class that I took when I was in seminary 20 years ago. We were shown a video of Fred Craddock preaching. There's some Candler grads in the room, obviously. In which he was describing meeting up with some folks who'd moved away from his hometown unexpectedly. He met up with them at a conference. "How's the church back home?" they asked. "Oh, you know," he said, "it died." "Oh, no," they said. "Oh, it's okay. It died in its sleep." In a not dissimilar way this week, people have been asking me, so how's the church back home? And I wouldn't blame you for wondering, rather like the disciples of Jesus on hearing of the death of Lazarus, why would we want to go there except to mourn? Surely the Methodist Church in Britain is not a place in which we would expect to find life and new inspiration for our leaders. Yet, as we, of necessity, face the stark reality of the death of the form of church we have known, we find ourselves, of necessity, in a new and poignant place in which to hear Jesus saying, "Lazarus, come out." A new place in which to hear the call to unbind one another, that we might help each other shed that which God no longer requires of us and is too heavy to carry, and find, like Sidwell, the path to a transfigured life. Perhaps in the UK we are further along this road than you all are here. Perhaps you are on a different road altogether. But it seems to me that we do have some things in common beyond our common heritage. Not least that we share the insight that at such a time as this, and we're needing a new slide, at such a time as this, as Jesus did with his apostles, we need to invest above all in our leaders. And so we share a desire to provide an effective and culturally relevant process of development and formation that supports clergy from the point of discerning a vocation to the end of active ministry. In both our contexts, I think there is a sense of shared urgency about this as we experience the following things. I'm going to need the points brought up one at a time, please. Rapid social change, denominational decline, political, social, and economic instability, all of which leads to a scarcity anxiety that in turn leads us towards pragmatic, presentist, and parochial attitudes. And it seems to me that in such circumstances, we both need to be forming leaders who ourselves, though affected and sometimes derailed by what's happening around us, are deeply enough rooted in the things of God that we can not only remain healthy ourselves in a turbulent environment, but lead Christian communities off the map into an uncertain future. For as David Jones says, when a civilization turns, God will not be found at the old landmarks. We could move to the next slide. Flourishing has been one of the key concepts at the heart of this conference. First and most directly, the work we've heard about, Flourishing, speaks of a concern for ministers and their health, and in this it echoes concerns in the British context about ministerial well-being, about burnout, about vocational disillusionment, and about retention rates. As I've listened in supervision sessions in my own context, I have an impression that many ministers in the Methodist Church in Britain are not flourishing, but using most of their energy surviving. As a new superintendent minister in London put it to me in supervision last week, if we could see the next slide, it feels as if I'm being squashed by an elephant. And as I struggle to breathe, Those responsible for my ministry point out the lions and the hyenas I should be factoring, but I can't deal with them all the while I'm stuck under the elephant. Next slide. If personal and institutional survival are on the agenda, whatever measures we put in place for clergy, they need to be experienced as supportive and not received as a way of implying that if clergy were only more effective, then all the ills of the church would be solved. It's not all our fault. Secondly, theologically and ecclesiologically, the flourishing of ministers is not only for its own sake, but for the sake of the flourishing of Christian communities in which ministers are called to lead. And as I've already referenced, in the British context, there are urgent questions about the flourishing of Methodist societies, where more than half our churches have fewer than 17 members, in which we have a very sharply aging set of congregations, and our mission field constitutes a population that, though 70% of people might believe in God, or more likely angels, less than 5% belong to any formal religious group. It's a context in which the gap between rich and poor is growing, and in which xenophobia and racist attitudes are on the rise, as evidenced by Brexit. How are our ministers to flourish in such a context? How are they to get out from under the elephant of numerical decline to a place where they can see the wood for the trees and help our people not only to grow in faith, but to be effective in mission? If the context demands new ways of remembering, reclaiming, and re-expressing the faith in a changed world, then whatever measures are put in place for clergy support, they need to equip them for a changed and changing context. And finally, as we try to resist the pragmatic and the presentist and the parochial tendencies of our age, as Methodist people rooted in a rich theology and history that is cosmic in its reach, it's important to remember that the flourishing of Christian communities is not only for the sake of the abundant life of those who belong to them, but is also for the sake of the flourishing of the whole inhabited earth. As your Commission for the Study of Mission states, the United Methodist Church is clear about its stated mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Yet in your context, as in mine, our imaginations can be limited by our fear about resources and lead us into a reversal of Wesley's vision, meaning that we no longer look upon the whole world as our parish, but upon our parish as the whole world. Meanwhile, our credibility can be damaged in the public mind because of our failures in safeguarding children and others as we work with people at vulnerable times in their lives. In Britain, this last concern led the Church to conduct a past cases review that resulted in 22 recommendations, 2 of which were most far-reaching. We'll put up now. So that a system of structured supervision for ministers be instituted to address the identified weakness in relation to accountability and support in terms of safe practice, and that serious consideration be given to producing a code of conduct for ministers. If parochialism and integrity are on the agenda, then whatever measures we put in place for clergy formation need to be able to tackle the normative issues of accountability and performance in relation to clear benchmarks and expectations for clergy against the horizon of God's purposes of justice and love. So, in order to provide an overarching approach that encompasses these 3 kinds of flourishing, the Methodist Church has adopted formal supervision as mandatory for all ordained ministers in the active work. To that end, from 2016-17, we conducted a pilot project in 2 districts. We trained all our district chairs, who have a similar organisational function to your bishops. We trained them all as supervisors. We trained some 30 people as trainers of supervisors, and we're now in the process of training some 400 people to supervise. The policy requires that by 2020, all ordained clergy in the active work will be in supervision. All supervisors will be trained and approved to supervise and will need to be in supervision themselves. And all ministers will need to be in supervision at least 90 minutes, 6 times a year in a one-to-one session. And it's a system by which agreed records will be kept and sent to the minister in oversight, or if you're being supervised by the minister in oversight, to a nominated third party. The model of supervision chosen, whilst it draws on skills from coaching and mentoring, is deliberately understood as part of the formal means by which the conference oversees the ministers under its discipline. It's conceived as both a realistic means of accountability for those in full connection who exercise ministry under the discipline of the conference, and as an embodied expression of the conference's duty of care to those in full connection with it. It is neither a tick-box system of oversight, ensuring that the rules are being followed, nor support that is unconditional and out with the discipline and priorities of the church. It is rather conceived as an accountable support for effective ministry that provides a context for and an expectation of lifelong learning. And to use yesterday's very helpful language from Matt even, it's not offstage, but it is backstage, yet a backstage in which there is a feedback loop to and from the performance area. Even so, it has even been experienced by some in the pilot work and amongst the district chairs as a redemptive structure. And I quote from the 2017 report to the British Conference, "It has operated as both a redemptive structure, a practice that shapes the encounters and interactions that happen within it in ways that promote human health and well-being in the light of God's self-revelation, not only for those present in the supervision room, but for those amongst whom ministers work, and as a means of grace in which God's transforming presence may be encountered." Crucially, this redemption is not only for those in the room, for the clergy person being supervised, but also for those not in the room who are impacted by the minister's work. Theologically, we have understood this holding together of accountability, learning, and support as an expression of Wesleyan discipleship that Mandy Maddox summed up as responsible grace. Just as in Wesley's thinking, human beings are invited not only to receive God's gift of grace in Jesus Christ, but to cooperate with it and be accountable to one another for living within that ecology of grace. We have used this phrase to describe the way in which those holding pastoral office not only receive the grace of ordination and the privileges of its status, but need an ongoing support for that ministry and a realistic context in which to be accountable for it through a variety of means of grace, of which supervision is now the chief. This model of supervision, therefore, deliberately holds together support, development, and accountability as part of responsible grace. Can I have the next slide, please? So its aims are to support the minister in their vocation, practice, and development, to safeguard the interests of those amongst whom ministry is practiced, including those of vulnerable children and adults, and to ensure the ministry offered in the name of the Methodist Church is collegially and accountably reflected upon in the light of God's mission and the purposes of the Methodist Church. The model of supervision is based on 3 pillars that some of us explored yesterday in a workshop, which is characterized by Inskip and Proctor as a 3-legged stool. The 3 legs helpfully rhyme with one another: the normative, the formative, and the restorative. In this conference, we've done a lot of thinking about the restorative, and it's extremely important. Without the restorative, you have no relationship in supervision. There's no accounting for the person as a person, for how the person is, for who the person is, and what they need, the impact of the work upon them. But if that's all we're doing, we're offering pastoral care. So if this is to be a system of formation and accountability, then we need to take account of learning needs, the formative stuff. We need to give people chances to grow and reflect. And we need to do this within some kind of shared and transparent horizon. That's to do with the horizon of God's grace, of God's purposes, but also our specific sense of the horizon of what is the ministry to which you are called and for which you are licensed. Next slide. So the way we've articulated this for our context is to say that what we mean by the normative is first shared theological reflection on the practices and vocation of ministry within the horizon of God's mission and within the Methodist Church's code of conduct. And second, the shared identification of risks to self and others and the identification of steps to ameliorate those risks. Secondly, under the formative, we have said that this should be support for lifelong learning, formation and development in ministry through shared reflection, and involve the exploration of creative approaches to demanding issues of ministry and relationships as they arise. And then the third leg of the stool, the restorative, for us this is about ensuring that the vocation and work of the ministry is shared, valued and nurtured, and ensuring that the health and well-being issues for ministers are addressed. So what is our hope in doing this? Well, the hope articulated by the Methodist Conference in Britain of 2017 on the basis of the evidence of the pilot project that we'd conducted is that regular supervision of this kind will result in some normative outcomes. We're hoping that we will have a more robust handling of risks in the life of the church, including but not only relating to those to do with safeguarding, through explicit attention to risk identification and risk management. We don't want to be a risk-averse church, but we do need to be a risk-alert church and to take proportionate and shared risks in our life together. We're hoping for more safety for everyone in church life through heightened awareness in supervision of boundaries, expected conduct, role clarity, and the use of power. We're hoping for more safety for everyone in church life through the opportunity in supervision to explore in practice the unconscious factors that sometimes thwart our best intentions and those of others. And we're hoping for clearer lines of accountability in which the responsibilities and roles of ministers in oversight are better understood and more routinely operated in practice, by which I mean that what is in the standing orders has some means of being implemented. Secondly, in relation to formative outcomes, we're hoping for a more intentional use of ministers' time through the opportunity that supervision provides for ministers to think theologically and in practice and in detail about what's actually going on. We're hoping for better communication as those in oversight become more aware, through supervising others and through receiving the records of supervision, of the actual challenges being faced on the ground in a multiplicity of contexts. We're also hoping that a culture of reflection on past practice will lead to improved future practice. We're expecting the routine identification of learning needs and then to have the opportunity to build resources, to signpost resources to meet those learning needs. And then thirdly, in terms of restorative outcomes, we're hoping for reduced symptoms of isolation and stress amongst our ministers through a realistic and regular structure of collegiality and accountability in which ministers are regularly sharing the detail of their practice and being listened to. And for us, this is to do with health, but it also makes the connection that Matt made yesterday that a lack of resilience often leads to mistakes, to misconduct, to people ending up outside our discipline. We're hoping to reduce all the symptoms of isolation and stress through this process, and also to change a system so that we might be dealing with less anxiety in the face of change as ministers share responsibility for difficult decisions, for taking risks, and for making priorities when not everything can be done. Well, you might say, hopes are all very well. Have you got any evidence that any of this is doing any good? I'll share with you some of the things that people have said in the pilot feedback. So under the normative outcomes, this is marvelous, this is my favorite one. I made a more secure intervention concerning a proposed exorcism than otherwise I would have done. I'm so sorry that the rules of confidentiality prevent me sharing the detail that is behind that. Perhaps more routinely, it allowed me to be challenged in the ways I'm working, to be accountable to someone set apart from the situation. And thirdly, this has reduced the chattering conversations between staff that may have led to misunderstanding. And so we don't have any of those. In terms of formative results, some samples of things people said. It's helped me to understand better when I am trying to please people rather than God. And I think this has come up for us in the last couple of days. And we can know, statistically clergy are people pleasers. We can even know I am a people pleaser. But actually, when am I doing it? And how can I develop strategies and be accountable for somebody who'll say to me, how are you getting on with the people pleasing? Or do you think this might be an example of people pleasing? Is another matter. And a second thought under the formative, it's allowed me to focus on aspects that I may not have given thought to otherwise. I think we see that in two ways. One is attending to aspects of ministry that naturally we wouldn't look at. So we have a system of ministerial development review. It's an annual thing. I know that's something else that you're charged with ensuring happens. Clergy are free to choose what they want to focus on. So guess what? They focus on the things they feel comfortable to focus on. But what about the things that the congregation are desperate for them to deal with? So this is about dealing with things in the round, but it's also about having someone else to see things in perspective, to see from different perspectives, so that it's not just me reflecting in my own head all the time and coming to the predictable conclusions. And then in terms of restorative results, three things. It's a safe place to share some painful experiences of ministry. This has reduced the chattering conversations between staff. So this is the first half of the quote we had earlier. Secondly, confidential sharing lifts a heaviness that normally is carried on your daily routine. And I think when Bishop Haller was preaching, we got some sense of the build-up of that kind of stress. And thirdly, in deepening awareness of what I need to do to enable my ministry, for example, to take time to be still, time out for prayer, and not feel guilty about that. So we know we ought to do these things. In my discipline, it says, you must have so many hours off a day, so many hours off a week, so many days for retreat. It says all that. It doesn't lead to people acting on it. So these are some of the results that we saw in the pilot. Two other things I want to do to share with you before we have some conversation together. I want to talk about what are some of the issues we faced in implementation. Because in some ways, in 2015, the team I work in was faced with a similar situation to yours, whilst you're charged by your general conference with providing through the 8-year assessment support, accountability, learning and growth opportunities. we were charged with implementing a system of structured supervision designed to address similar restorative, formative, and normative issues. So I hope it might be useful to rehearse with you some of the things we've had to tackle in order to implement that. I'm going to do so with use of something called the supervision rhombus. And you'll see the blue shape in the middle. It is a rhombus, if you remember from primary school, and it has 4 corners. And supervision literature more generally suggests to us that appropriate supervision always takes account of all 4 corners. I think our natural inclination, whenever we're thinking about a coaching relationship or a mentoring relationship or a supervision relationship, is to think about the relationship between the person offering the support and the person being supported. And that's the lateral relationship, the horizontal one in the middle between supervisor and supervisee. But what's being suggested here is that if you do that in isolation, it kind of free floats. And it raises all sorts of difficult questions which need answering in a different way. So it raises the question, to what horizon are you mentoring or coaching or supervising? In our context, what are the normative ministry requirements? What is our doctrine? And are we preaching our doctrines? And what have we said as a denomination about what it is to be a local pastor or a deacon or an elder? And if we haven't got that in view and we haven't got in a shared reference point for that, then what we're doing in the supervision relationship can be very idiosyncratic. And then the second kind of thing to pay attention to is what's below the line, which is the practice of the minister. So it raises the question of what are you actually going to talk about? How are you going to get anything realistic into the room? So just to say a little bit more about those kind of 3 areas that we've had to kind of juggle with as we've tried to systematize this supervision in our system. So in answering the question, what are the normative expectations for clergy? In the British context, we have normative expectations for candidates, for ministers in training, for probationer ministers, and we have benchmarks for acceptance, for stationing, and for ordination. And all of these stages, we group our expectations under the 6 categories on the left of this chart. And we've been using these since 1995 for assessing candidates, for devising curriculum in seminaries, and for reporting to oversight bodies. And in the context of supervising student ministers, which is what a lot of my work has been doing, we realized how helpful it was to have benchmarks to which to point that both the supervisor and the minister on trial could reference as the goals of formation. But as we started to think about implementing supervision amongst ordained clergy and experienced clergy, we realized that our ongoing expectations of clergy were very diffusely expressed and scattered through our book of discipline. And that was why the Past Cases Review wanted a code of conduct that would not only make expectations clearer to everyone, would also make it clear in supervision what are the parameters for ministerial identity and behaviour within which we need to supervise. And this is important both to support appropriate formation and growth through the changing seasons of life and ministry, but also in order to help clergy identify risky behaviour and address it, ideally before they find themselves outside the discipline of the church. The second set of questions that we looked at concern that horizontal relationship, and they've concerned the boundaries of the supervision relationship. We knew that the relationship had to be one of trust, and we knew that appropriate confidentiality would be key to this. If you don't have that, you have not created any kind of backstage. Yet we also knew that one of the institutional weaknesses identified through our past cases review into abuse and bullying was in the area of accountability. Nobody knew what anybody else was up to. So we decided that supervision had to be understood as a contribution to oversight. Our pilot project assumed that normally the supervising minister would supervise their colleagues, and this produced advantages in terms of building trust in teams and a detailed knowledge of work in many cases. Of course, in some cases it wasn't practical because we didn't allow any supervisor to take on more than 8 supervisees. If you're a DS, that's not going to work. But what it did mean was that our superintendents, our district chairs had to think, with whom should I be sharing this work? Even Moses had to be persuaded he couldn't do it all on his own. The feedback from those who were not supervised by their own minister with oversight was that it was helpful to have a space set apart from their daily context in which to reflect and in which they felt able to be more open. But what we insisted on was that a bare record would go of that supervision to the minister in oversight so that they knew what topics were being discussed, they knew what risks had been discussed and what steps were taken to ameliorate them, and they had a note of any referrals needed to other processes like safeguarding or discipline or competence. And what has secured the confidentiality of the majority of what happens in a supervision is that if it's not written on the form, it can't leave the room. So if the supervisor feels this issue needs to be referred into a discipline or competence process, then the supervisee knows that, and that's the only basis on which a minister in oversight can act upon it, whether they're the supervisor or not. So this is the way in which we've sought to balance trust and accountability, to maintain both the backstage space, but with a link to the front stage, so that the backstage is not just an echo chamber amongst our chosen peers. Next slide. The third question that we've had to address, and the last one, concerns the practice of the supervisee and how the work can be realistically brought into the room in such a way that the time is intentionally spent and is not simply another context for general pastoral conversation, for advice giving, for task planning, for competitive sharing, or for moaning about the life of the church. So Matt said yesterday it's good for pastors to be together. That's part of a healthy ecology. I absolutely agree with that. And if I told you I didn't spend time in drinking institutions with colleagues moaning about the life of the church, I would be lying. However, cathartic as that is, it doesn't take me very far forwards. So the question is, great for pastors to spend time together doing what? So the training of supervisors has focused not only on the norms for clergy expectations, the top of the rhombus, and the boundaries of the supervision relationship, the horizontal dynamic, but on the skills that will enable the time to be effectively spent. And we've drawn on the notion that supervision might operate as a means of grace and looked in detail at Wesley's sermon on visiting the sick from 1786, in which he describes not only works of piety, but also works of mercy as means of grace. And from his description of pastoral visitation as a means of grace, we've taken the following points, and I'll need them up in turn. Firstly, that pastoral supervision needs to be eccentric. Now, by that, I don't mean idiosyncratic. I mean, from the Latin, out of the centre. It's not a peer space where we both share. It's a space in which one person puts themselves at the disposal of the other for their development and for the sake of those amongst whom they work. Second, it's prayerful throughout, before, during, and after. We are looking for a sense that as we meet, God might meet us and lead us somewhere new that neither of us has been before. It's not advice giving. And third, being good Methodists, it needs to be structured. In pastoral visitation, Wesley had a series of questions to be asked: inquire this, inquire that, inquire the other, and so do we. And the way that we formulated that on the next slide is to see supervision as primarily a reflective and exploratory process. And we've devised the Greenwich Foot Tunnel model of supervision. Back please to the Victorian picture. There is an actual tunnel between Greenwich in England and the Isle of Dogs on the other side of the Thames. It was built a century ago, not actually precisely to this design. It has a shallow V in it, which means that you can't see one end of the tunnel from the other when you're in it. It does have the two beautiful rotundas and the staircases built at either end. Now we have the next slide. So this rather less beautiful map of that tunnel is what we use to map the processes of supervision. And crucially, supervision's not about what you can do by going across the Thames on the surface. It's about digging deeper. And I think there's a reference there again to Bishop Haller's sermon. So we begin in the first rotunda. The supervisor waits to greet the supervisee, to host and contain them, to offer prayer, to welcome them. And then the business starts, which is of going down the first staircase. And this is the business of focusing and eliciting. What are you bringing to supervision today? And crucially, what do you hope to gain from bringing this to supervision today? Because if you don't know together what it is that you need to get to, why you're bringing this here today, then you're not going to make an effective use of the time, and you're not going to know whether or not you've made an effective use of the time. You can't track and monitor it together. The bulk of the session is that bottom part of the tunnel in the shallow V, together exploring and imagining, seeing things from different perspectives, playing with it, asking different questions, doing a risk assessment, talking things through, noticing, wondering, realizing, showing the supervisor. Literally, we had all sorts of toys out in the workshop. We had cards, we had cloths. I have a box of objects that it looks like a box of trash. My students used to call it, I don't know if I dare, this is not being streamed, is it? My students used to call it my box of shit. We use all sorts of methods to get the work into the room so that we can look at it together, and then to ask, how are we getting on with the question that we were addressing? What more do we need to do? Is there anything you need to rehearse? What are the next steps? And yesterday we were rehearsing asking tough questions of the people that we need to go back to and deal with some normative stuff with. So the second staircase, we're bridging and enacting back into the practice of the supervisee. And in the second rotunda, reviewing, closing, paperwork, prayer, saying goodbye, making the next appointment. Next slide. We're seeing this as a way of giving account. To be accountable through supervision is literally to share an account of what is happening in ministry, like the apostles in Mark 6, who after they had been sent out, gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. At a sufficient level of detail and over time in a sufficiently rounded way for a supervisor or minister in oversight to be confident in the practice, self-awareness, and well-being of the minister concerned. This is not about ensuring perfect practice from perfect practitioners. It's about ensuring good enough practice amongst well enough supported practitioners. So lastly, some practical questions for you as you think about implementing the 8-year assessment. I've shared with you some of the challenges for us in seeking to implement a system of supervision that would meet concerns about ministerial well-being, ministerial development for a changing context, and ministerial competence in a way that ensures we are both safe to practice and allowing ourselves to be inspired by the cosmic horizon of God's purposes of justice and love as expressed in our doctrines. And as we move towards a time for you to reflect on my presentation in your teams, I offer the following questions, and they are available on the website if you want to log into them to reference them in your conversation. So, under the normative heading, what are the benchmarks for ordained ministers or for local pastors in terms of behaviour, attitudes, and competence? And how might these relate to 8-year assessment? How might the competency areas and the case-apps identified by the effective research in ministry that GBHM have been doing, how might they help to structure not only this 8-year assessment, but also recruitment, candidacy, training and formation for ministry amongst clergy, so that you might be dealing with the whole arc of formation, and wherever you are, whether as somebody being assessed or somebody assessing or accompanying somebody through assessment or being accompanied, wherever you are in it, you know where you are and you know what the expectations of you are. And secondly, under the normative heading, what are the goals of 8-year assessment and how might these be communicated as part of a broad horizon? For example, effectiveness is not a theological value in itself. Jesus did not say, "Blessed are the effective." This is not a vision that will inspire anybody. But given that Jesus did say, "Blessed are the peacemakers," it might matter that our clergy are effective agents of reconciliation. And if so, how do we ensure that we are appropriately supported and equipped to identify and fight the powers of darkness as they appear in destructive conflict, and shape Christian communities that are places where difference and difficulty are handled in a creative and healthy way, and from which mission can happen? So the question is, how do we articulate the goals, the horizons? And the third question under the normative heading, what kind of intentional accompaniment do our clergy need? Not only in this 8-year assessment period, that's 6 months, but as an ongoing support for accountable ministry. And how might accountability and support be held together? Next slide. Then some formative questions. What skills and training are going to be needed for those offering accompaniment for the 6-month 8-year assessment period and for ongoing clergy formation? What tools can be offered that ensure that the time in such meetings is intentionally spent? I think one of the reasons that GBHEM stumped up for a book of mine for you all, for which I'm very grateful, is that there's lots of actual practical things at the end of each chapter to do and try. All I would say is try them on yourself or a friend before you do with anyone for whom you have formal responsibility. A serious point. Who will be trained to offer this support, this accompaniment? What kinds of learning needs might be uncovered and how might these be addressed? What learning and development resources are already available and how might these be signposted? And how can you keep learning as a team about the issues facing clergy and how to address them from this window you're getting into the life and work of practitioners? This is something we found really useful in the British Church, that through supervision, we're realizing what are the issues being dealt with on the ground. And then lastly, under the restorative heading, how are you feeling, you people who have to implement this, how are you feeling as you face this task? Because if you don't unearth that, you're going to cycle it into whatever you do. What feelings might those who first undergo this 8-year assessment experience, how might they be explored and addressed? What difficult feelings might be encountered as clergy are invited to probe deeply into their ministries and vocations? You know, for those of us who kept a lid on it for 20 years or 30 years, this is going to be quite a thing, to be asked to reflect at depth and to share. There's going to be a lot of stuff come up. How are we going to be resourced for that? And what support might those who are accompanists in this process need so that they're able to offer that appropriate support? What will come up for them as stuff comes up for other people, and where will they go with it? These are my questions for you. We have some time for discussion. I'll consult with Greg about exactly how much time. And if we could just have the resources page up. On the website, the resources list is there if you want to follow up anything I've been saying. And after a bit of time in groups, I will take plenary questions if there are things you want to address with me. I will be here the rest of the morning if you want to come and see me in person. Thank you very much.
So we have about 10 to 15 minutes right now for you to reflect on what Dr. Leach has just presented, and we'll come back then for some plenary questions. And then we have some wrap-up and closing comments as we send you to talk among the annual conferences in the Learning Lab. So take some time now to reflect. The Lord be with you. What questions or comments or reflections might you have for Jane, and we can have a conversation there. So the question was a difference between supervision as you are articulating it and a coaching model.
So we have seen the difference between supervision and coaching as the kind of supervision we're offering is, or requiring, is online. It's not offline, it's not self-sought, and it's not directed simply to the goals that are determined by the supervisee. So it's a shared system of implementing oversight in which there's a common set of parameters and goals. And some of the tools of coaching are very useful, but it's set within this more oversight context. Does that help? Sure.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Matt Woodbury from the South Georgia Conference.
Hey.
Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. It's really got us energized over here. My question is, how or was it considered to include the laity in any aspect of this?
Yeah. So we don't have laity with pastoral charge of churches, so we don't have anything like your local pastor scheme, but we are aware that we do have lay people in offices with significant pastoral influence. And the policy, as we have it at the moment, says that we encourage the extension of supervision to lay people with significant pastoral responsibility. I mean, like in any system, we're trying to do a massive system change, a massive culture change here. So you have to start with your points of leverage. So one of our points of leverage was to do a pilot. Another point of leverage was to work with the senior leaders in the church. And then once we'd done that, the next biggest point of leadership is the people under discipline of the conference. So that's where we're working next. We're deliberately trying to be a learning organization. So we brought legislation in 2015 that said we want to do this. In 2017, we've done a pilot. In 2020, we go back and we say, now all ordained ministers are in supervision. What would you like us to do next? And the expectation is that by then we will have a lot more knowledge as a church about what this involves, both in terms of, how do we do this supervision thing well, and also how does it operate in the system, what sort of resources are needed for it. And that will enable us to work out what's an appropriate model for lay people with those kinds of responsibilities. I mean, it's not the right thing for every office, but it is, I think, a very helpful thing for any office where the person is the tool for the work. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah. Hey.
So one of the differences between your system and ours is your circuit system. I'm curious to hear how your circuit model impacts us, both in a positive way or in a negative way.
So the circuit system means that we've kind of got a tier in a way in between as far as I understand it, in your annual conferences, you have bishop and you have district superintendents, and then you have the local church. And the distance, in terms of it's a numerical distance or geographical distance, you perhaps got 100 pastors to your district superintendent, whereas probably tops we've maybe got 30 pastors to a superintendent in a circuit. But you can see immediately on the math that even in a circuit with 30 pastors, you can't supervise like this, so 30 people. So we said from the outset, we must distinguish oversight and supervision. And that means we've had to reinterpret some of our standing orders, which talk about supervising in the circuits, supervising in the districts. So the superintendent and the district chair in our system retain the responsibility for overseeing the work and the fidelity and character of our ministers. But like Moses had to delegate it, they nominate people to be approved and trained as supervisors. So we have said that might operate within circuits, or you might think it's better in your context to operate it across circuits deliberately, so that you're not being supervised by your minister with oversight. And it is the district chair's responsibility, and I would say in your system, if you were doing this, it would be the district superintendent's responsibility to say, how are we going to make this work in our system? If we've got 100 people to be supervised, then we need 12 supervisors, whatever the maths is. Who are the best 12 people to be doing this? And we've said it doesn't necessarily belong with ordination. We might have some lay people who would have excellent transferable skills for this, and they would do the detailed work and provide the records of that work to the district superintendent. So the district superintendent might supervise a good number of the people who are supervising and receive the records of all the supervisions that go on, but need not be hands-on with all the local pastors. Am I making some sense? Stunned you all into silence.
Well, thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation.
Thank you.